Hello, Anthony. It's David Roach again. I'm going to reply to your five questions about the dollar by doing this recording because I'm on the road and I don't have time to type what are intricate responses to very good questions. Let us start with the worst fall in a year for the US dollar. What are the key factors? Well, I think there are several key factors. The first thing is all the ones you mentioned, which is the return to investors uh, of holding US dollars, which was an unquestionable superior return for maybe most part of a decade due to US exceptionalism, has ended because of all the factors that have happened to the macroeconomy. And that look, therefore, people don't want to hold the dollar because, if you hold the dollar in US treasuries, you're down about, well, 9% of the 10% of the dollar and more, and probably another 10% on your treasuries, which is down about 20% loss. So that's going to make people think twice before they invest in the dollar without thinking. The second factor is that the actual uncertainty or disruption which Trump has introduced into the world, which involves tearing up trade relationships, tearing up treaties and alliances, obviously undermines the idea of holding the dollar as a safe haven because those holdings are not guaranteed, they're not protected, they're subject to all of the vagaries which Trump has applied to the globalized economy as well as to alliances. So the US is no longer a safe place. Third factor is that Trump's program, even if it succeeds in doing what he wants it to do, will undermine the role of the US dollar as a reserve currency. And that will happen for several reasons. First of all, the US is going to make foreigners pay to access their markets. That's what tariffs are about. And secondly, there is a lot of talk about taxing foreigners on their holdings of US treasuries. So, in other words, you're directly trying to make foreigners pay for the privilege of financing the US domestic savings deficit and external current account deficit, which is, of course, nonsense. But there is another factor, and that is that the US will be a much smaller imprint on global trade. And if it's a smaller imprint on global trade, then presumably the current account deficits of the US will be smaller, but the US will also be growing more slowly. And therefore, the dollar will actually not receive the same amount of capital, the same amount of dollars, liquid dollars, is received every year from the globalized trade mechanism. That mechanism was very simple to say was that the US ran a deficit in manufacturing goods. Others accumulated a surplus of dollars to pay for those manufacturing goods. And also, those dollars remained in the hands of foreigners and they were reinvested in US treasuries. Now, as we go forward, the US will not be pumping out those dollars because its current account deficit will be smaller, its imports will be smaller, and therefore the flow of dollars into foreign hands will be smaller. Now, why that matters is because it means that as those countries outside the US, China, Global South, even Europe, will be growing faster than the United States and trading increasingly with each other rather than with the United States, they need a new currency. And that is why arithmetically speaking, the success of Trump's policies will mean that the dollar will be a smaller portion of total global payments, store of wealth, capital, etc. And therefore, its role as the global reserve currency will decline. Okay, that's why one and two are the same. Yes, you're saying a long-term shift away from dollar dominance for the reasons I just stated. Corporate finance decisions are very slow to change. They follow normally the events in the economy, markets, and geopolitics with a lag. But I think there are several counter flows which are involved here. First of all, you may get some flow of foreign capital into the US to invest in supplying US domestic demand because it will be too expensive to supply it from overseas capacity, which will be under tariffs and so on. But in the main, what this actually does is to reduce the attractiveness of foreign corporations investing in the US and increase the attractiveness of foreign investment investing in other markets, particularly, I think, Europeans versus China. And the reason that will happen is because the other markets will be growing faster. The US will be growing slower thanks to tariffs and higher inflation. Real returns will rise outside the United States and they will fall in the United States. So what happens is that people in corporate boardrooms, they decide to go where the money flow is, where the profits are, which will be outside the United States. So in general, I think you will see the first reaction is to get inside the tariff walls. The second reaction is to go where the growth and profits are. And to add to that, then I come back to the point I made in the first answer to your questions, which is that it is very rare that trade protectionism is not followed by capital market controls. In other words, that the US will inhibit particularly the flow outwards of the $18 trillion worth of equities and $14 trillion worth of debt which foreigners own. Now, this may take two forms. They may actually stop them taking the money out of the United States, which will certainly stop them putting more money into the United States. And the Swiss banks are worried about that already. And the second thing they may well do is not impede the flow completely, but actually tax it. So I think that also builds into the negative dollar story. And if that sounds far-fetched, that protectionist measures on trade are normally followed by protectionist measures on capital. Well, it's already happening. If you look at how the US is impeding the flow of foreign direct investment into China and the sectors it can invest in and so on, you're already seeing that starting to happen. So that is a huge impediment, putting money into the US market, which after all, as it'll be operating behind tariff walls, will by definition be less competitive, less innovative in comparison to the remaining globalized economies, the free markets outside the US. So that I think handles the story about what happens in the corporate boardrooms. Well, de-dollarization I really dealt with. There is an inevitability of de-dollarization because the US will simply, because of its smaller imprint on the global economy and because of its smaller role in trade, and because it will be running much smaller current account deficits, will by definition be feeding less capital into global markets, which will need more capital than that. The reason they will need more capital than that is because the countries outside the United States will be trading with each other and will be growing faster than the United States. So the question is not about what country is doing what. It really is that arithmetically, that means there has to be another global reserve currency. It's not going to knock the dollar completely off its perch because there's a huge stock of dollars out there, but the incremental growth may go to other currencies. What could they be? Could be the euro. The euro is well-balanced currency. They're starting to create a pool of risk-free assets for central banks to invest in at the level of the EU Commission, which is not a conscious objective, but it's the result of the joint financing by the European partners of increased defense expenditure and the implementation of the reform programs of the Draghi and later report. So that would help the euro. The most likely global trading currencies, however, the yuan, which will have to be really ring-marked and protected against the vagaries of Chinese law and events within China. So it's got to be rather like their swap deals with other central banks. The PBOC swap deals with 32 other central banks. It really is. They are agreements which are taken really out of the Chinese domestic scene for all its uncertainties and exist in an offshore yuan market. And I think China will probably go down that particular route. The disadvantage, of course, is that neither the Europeans nor the Chinese run a current account deficit, which you actually need in order to feed the demand for dollars in other countries as you go forward. That can be dealt with artificially by creating an offshore yuan, by creating an offshore euro. We see where we go, but the need for another reserve currency is really an arithmetic inevitability of the world we're looking into. You said, does the dollar's recent performance undermine its role as the world's reserve currency? Yes, it does, because it doesn't provide the safe haven stability it's supposed to do. I don't think it is overstated, but I think it can be overdone in the short term. But I'm not the sort of person who deals with the ups and downs of markets. I'm sure there'll be lots of moments when the dollar strengthens a bit and people will say, look, all those dollar bears were wrong. All those guys who said the dollar was structurally flawed and finished, you see, they're just wrong. You get lots of that, but it does not concern me. I'm only interested in drawing a map in which the lines are bold and simplified, and that I hope I've done in this short uh, recording. Go well.